All right, we're going to be talking about manipulation now. So again, is there anyone here who's ever felt used? Do you remember what was said or what was done that kind of aroused those emotions? What made you feel used? All right, now I'm not trying to bring up any painful memories. That's not my purpose. But I do want you to recall the pain that you felt from having been used. Because I want us now to realize how other people feel when they're being used. I want you to realize what that feels like. Now, I want us to close some doors today, and we're going to be looking at manipulation. Now, no one wants to think of himself as a manipulator. None of us want to think of ourselves that way. In fact, if I ask how many of you have resorted to manipulation to get what you want, I promise you there would be no one here that would hold up their hand and say, yes, I've done that. But in a subtle way, very few people escape using manipulation altogether. Now, even if you're sitting there and you're thinking that, well, that's not me, I'm certainly not a manipulator, at least I want you to keep your mind open, because if we understand the full ramifications now of what manipulation involves, hopefully it's going to help us to avoid this subtle pitfall, because not all manipulation is obvious. Sometimes we can get into manipulation and not even realize we've done that. Now, we're going to look at manipulation from two angles. We're going to look at it from the angle of being manipulated and from the angle of being the manipulator. Now, this is not intended to be some deep psychological study. That's what I'm doing. I'm not going into why somebody manipulates. My objective now tonight is just to point out some areas when and where manipulation occurs. See, when something is exposed, it can be dealt with. And that's why when there's things we don't want, we need to expose it, we need to talk about it, and we can get rid of it. So now let me give you the definition. The definition is just kind of in simple terms. Anytime someone uses his influence in an unfair way to try to force another person now to do something outside of their will, that's manipulation. That's putting it very simply. In other words, to unfairly coerce another person into doing something that person doesn't want to do. I think we've all seen that happen. Hopefully, we haven't been the one doing it, but we've seen it happen many times, maybe even to us. Now, do you know what the bottom line is of manipulation? The bottom line, in whatever area a person is manipulating, in that area, the person is not seeing God as his source. If we have to manipulate, then we're not seeing God as our source. Now, I've known people who trusted God in so many areas, and yet they may have just one little area over here where they're in fear, and they try to manipulate to get what it is they need because they don't think they can get it any other way. Now, it always helps me to realize that if I have to resort now to manipulation, then that means I'm not trusting God. And that's the first thing we need to realize, because manipulation never happens where there's an absolute trust in God. It never happens when we're there. Now, you can mark this down as an absolute. God may use us to absolutely change our world, but he's not going to use us ever to manipulate, to change things. And there's a big difference in that, because no one has the right to control another person. Neither shall one allow himself to be controlled and manipulated. We should never allow that to happen. Now, the only thing that the Bible says that should control us is the love of Christ. And when we have the love of Christ controlling us, then we don't need to allow ourselves to be manipulated by anyone or anything else, and we don't need to be the one manipulating anyone else. Now, don't confuse this with the need to cooperate. Now, a lot of people, they think, oh, I don't want to be manipulated, and so they refuse to cooperate. But I've seen people who wouldn't cooperate or even work with anyone simply because they were afraid that they would finally be controlled, that allowed the control to come over. Well, that is as wrong as the other extreme. And so God sent his Holy Spirit not to drive us, not to manipulate or to force us into anything. He sent his Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth. And that's where God is wanting us to come to the place where we allow him to guide us into all truth. Now, that's why we don't change from our wrongdoing many times, because what we're doing, we're waiting for God now to coerce and manipulate us into going his way. We're waiting for God to push us and give us those punches and those urges, because we're so accustomed to game playing in the world. And because he doesn't work that way, many times we mistakenly think that He's approving, and we don't think there's anything we need to do to change. Now, because he didn't try to force us, we think everything's okay between him and us. And we go right on our merry way many times. Now, there's times when I wish God would manipulate me. I even prayed once, and I was being silly that time, but I said, God, I wish you'd just manipulate me and get me to do your will every single time. Now, I don't know about you, but I would love for God to force me onto the right path every single time. I wish he would just do that for me. But he doesn't work that way. Neither does he excuse our actions when we try to work it that way. Now, this week and next, I'm going to give you 8 of the more common areas of manipulation. But before, we're going to get into examples of manipulation and how to overcome it, because it really is a deadly thing. Now, I want to give you 3 possible misunderstandings. Now, these are important because I don't want to clean up one area and cause a problem in some other area. And so we're going to think about that tonight. Now, the number 1 misunderstanding is mainly to husbands and wives. Now, you'll all be there someday, so you need to hear this too. Now, there may be something that you are legitimately supposed to be doing for your mate. You'll know someday. There may be something you need to legitimately be doing and that you're not doing. And I could give you a long list now off the top of my head even. Maybe not spending enough time with the mate, maybe not doing your share of the work, or maybe not helping fulfill your share of the discipline, maybe just not carrying your responsibility. Now, if there is a legitimate area where we're falling short, then the frustration that can bring a mate will often cause that mate to fall into manipulation themselves. And they do that in an attempt to get what they need. So if that's our shortcoming, that has opened the door many times to manipulation. And then we can share the responsibility and the sin if that happens. Now, I'm not saying that that excuses our manipulation. It doesn't. But when we open the door and we help entice someone toward their weakness, we're going to share in their guilt. Okay, now, caution number 2 is the strong-willed person. Now, a lot of strong-willed people have a fear of being controlled. And so often they fear being controlled, they fear being manipulated, so they build walls to guard themselves against being manipulated. And sometimes they do it to such an extent that they literally balk even at suggestions that are being made to them. And that fear will often cause them not to even be cooperative with each other, not to even listen to sound advice many times. Now, if you're a very strong-willed person, the chances are very high now that there is a fear that someone's going to take advantage of you. And a lot of people go around fearing, oh, this person's going to take advantage of me, and they're constantly worrying about that. You don't want that fear because it leads to stubbornness and to an unwillingness to work well with other people. We want to be able to work with people in the way God intends us to do it. Okay, caution number 3 to parents now. The fear of being manipulative or the fear of controlling another person now can keep a parent from exercising the authority that God has given to him in rearing his children. And I want you to remember that because that happens so many times. God has given us rules by which we are to live. The 10 Commandments is just a good start. And he expects us as parents now to have certain rules by which we govern our families. And that's a part of our responsibility to our children and to our grandchildren. Now, the disciplining of our children is a God-given responsibility. It's not just a suggestion. It's not something God's suggesting. It is a responsibility, and it's required. Now, as long as our children are living in our home, there are to be some household rules that are consistently enforced. And that's a part of the necessary training that a child has to have from the home that he grows up in if he's going to be a responsible adult. And that's not manipulation. That's not control. Now, if your child is living in your home, do not allow them to tell you what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. I see that in so many homes today, but we're never to allow a child to tell us what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. Now, it's not manipulation to enforce household rules. In fact, if they are grown children in the home, it's fine to give them an ultimatum. You can say, I love you and I want you here, but you will live peaceably by the rules of this household. I want your actions and your attitudes to join in with the family. Or you can move without financial support from us. And a lot of parents need to say that to their grown children who are still living there trying to run the home. So be sure your rules are not overbearing. Now, you may need to seek wisdom from someone who can help you in that area, because we don't want to provoke our children to anger. That is something that we need to guard our hearts. And yes, we can be in control over our household, but we should never want to provoke them to anger. But nothing now destroys a child faster than having no consistently enforced guidelines to go by. Because what it does, if they don't have any guidelines, it allows them to get into rebellion. And that rebellion will finally affect their walk with God. We want to protect their walk with God more than anything else. Okay, now, with those 3 areas of possible misconceptions covered, I want us to move on. Now, I'm going to be giving you 8 areas where manipulation is most used, and we'll look at 3 of them this week. Now, number 1 avenue of manipulation is when one plays on someone else's emotions, or when they play on somebody else's insecurity, in an attempt now to get that person to do exactly what they want them to do. And that's manipulation, and that's unfair, and God does not allow it. He doesn't bless that. For example, if you don't do as I desire, and I hold back something from you now that you need emotionally, if I hold back maybe my affection, or I hold back my love, my help, in an attempt now to force you, that's manipulation. And a lot of people do it, and they would never even consider the fact that they were being manipulative. So I want you now to really follow with me as we get into some of the ways in which, hopefully, we'll see manipulation in a little better light. Now, an easy example to follow is the guy who says to the girl he's dating, "If you don't go to bed with me, that means you don't really love me. Therefore, there's really no need for us to date any longer. We may as well just break up." And I've known of guys who have actually said that. Now, that's a play on her insecurity to hold back his willingness to date, or at least to make her think that he's not going to be willing to date her. And that's in an attempt sometime to force her, manipulate her into doing what he wants her to do. Now, that's not a new tactic. So if you'll turn to Judges 16, verse 15, you remember the story of Samson and Delilah. Now, we think of Samson as being so strong, and he was in the physical realm. But because he was over in enemy territory, he was open to an evil target. Delilah wanted to know the secret of Samson's strength. So in Judges 16, verse 15, she begins to play on his emotions. And she manipulates and she deceives Samson until she gets his secret. And in verse 15, she's saying, "Talk is cheap. I want answers from you." Manipulation finally becomes an open door to deception. Now in Judges 16, verse 15, Delilah says, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength is coming from." And so she continues and continues until he finally breaks down. And he just whitewashes the old things just to make everything look new. I'm about 6 years older than my sister, and before I married, I could remember saying to her, "I have so much homework tonight. I'm never going to be able to get to bed, and I know it's my time to do the dishes, but could you do them for me tonight?" Now, I didn't come right out and just overtly ask her, but I let her know how much homework I had, and I finally got to her sympathy button, and she'd do the dishes. Now, I felt justified because I did have a lot of homework, and because I was older, I had more homework than she did, and that was the truth. But I could have had the dishes done in the time that I spent trying to manipulate her to get them done. And instead, so I manipulated my way out of those dishes. We do those kinds of things, and many times it doesn't cross our mind that we're in manipulation. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to ask somebody for help. It's not wrong to even explain your circumstances, but it needs to be open and it needs to be forthright and honest. Now, it would have been fine if there had been a legitimate need for me to have said, "I have a big test tomorrow. Would you trade off with me? And would you do the dishes for me? And then I'll reciprocate." Now, that would have been forthright and honest. But too many times we don't realize we're not quite going to that extent, and we're manipulating without realizing it. But it's not right when we coerce with sympathy games and with guilt. And I'm seeing that happen so much across the body of Christ. Now, if we play on somebody's emotions, if we play on their sympathy, their guilt, maybe their insecurity, their fears, especially if it's someone in the family, if we do it in an attempt to coerce them into doing something that they don't want to do, then that's wrong. And God's not going to bless that. Now, you know times when you've been pushed into doing something that you really didn't think you were supposed to do. Now, I'm not talking about sin. I'm not talking about over in the area of sin. I'm talking about something God has not necessarily telling you to do. Yet you felt manipulated into it because someone played on your emotions. And how did that make you feel? You feel used, you feel angry at yourself many times, and angry with the one who manipulates. And absolutely no good fruit comes out of it. In John 6, verse 66, you can look it up later, but Jesus is our example. And Jesus began to teach a doctrine that his disciples didn't understand. And he began to teach, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, or you'll have no life in you. Well, because they didn't understand, the Bible says that many of the people ceased to follow him, and they quit following him. They didn't go with him any longer. They withdrew and followed with him no more. Now, we know that was a concern to the Lord, because he turned to the 12, and he actually asked them, he said, are you going to leave me too? Are you going to leave me? So he was concerned about the ones who had left. But he neither manipulated to keep them, nor did he succumb to the manipulation that they were trying to put on him. Okay, in other words, he didn't let them manipulate him into changing what he taught by the threats. Okay, now some people will use symptoms of sickness and play out on somebody else's emotions. I've seen children, I've seen husbands, I've seen wives who have faked stomach aches, headaches and so forth, in an attempt to get their way in a certain area, or to get attention, or to get sympathy that they think they need. That is such a dangerous place. If we play with manipulation in the least little bit, it doesn't stay the same, it grows. I can promise you it grows. Now, if you've ever used that kind of tactic, be very, very careful, because I promise when you start it, you'll continue it. And pretty soon, you won't have to fake the symptoms anymore. Satan will finally oblige, and he'll make those symptoms real. Now, I know one girl who said that she would fake labor pain and actually go to the hospital and to get attention from her husband. Now, she had several children, but on that last one, she almost ended up losing the baby. This is a true case. And she still didn't get the attention that she wanted. Manipulation never brings us ultimately what we want. It's dangerous. Now, Luke 15:25, this is the story of the prodigal son. Now, if you'll remember, he had gotten his share of the inheritance, and he had squandered it all on unrighteous living. You remember the story. Well, finally, he gets so low that he comes back as a servant, and he comes to his father's house, and the father is so happy to have his younger son home that he puts a robe on him, he puts a ring on his finger, and he gives him this big party. Now, the older brother, he's out in the field and he's working, and he has faithfully always been there for his father. And he gets close to the house, and of course he hears all the music, he hears all the dancing, and I'm sure that during those years, while that older brother was home working, I'm sure he would think about the fact that his younger brother was off having fun. He was off doing his own thing. I'm sure he thought about how his brother had been spending all his inheritance, and he probably felt like a martyr. Now, in verse 25, now his older brother was in the field, and when he came back home that evening and he approached the house, he heard all this music, he heard all this dancing, and he summonsed one of the servants, and he said, what's going on? Where's the music come from? What's going on? And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he is so happy to have him home, and he's received him back safe and sound. But he became very angry, and he was not willing to go in, and his father came out and began entreating him. Now, I want you to notice how he has his own little pity party, and yet he makes sure his father knows he's outside. He doesn't have his pity party by himself. He makes sure that the father knows that he's been very mistreated. So the father comes out, and he begins to entreat him. Now, I can just hear him, son, your brother is home. Come on in. We're having a party. We're celebrating his homecoming. And in verse 29, I want you to know how logical that sounds. Verse 29, but he announced and he said to his father, look, for so many years I've been serving you, and I've never neglected a command of yours. And yet you have never given me a kid that I might be merry with my friends. Okay, I want you to notice how logical he's sounding. Okay, that almost sounds convincing. And some parents would have been swayed by that. Some parents would have given in to that. And he began to try to manipulate his father because he wanted the father to feel guilty. When we're in manipulation, we use the guilt. You have never given me a commandment that I've not obeyed. He said, I've always obeyed you. I've always been here. That would be very easy to, start sympathizing to that word. I've never been in rebellion. Now that sounds pretty good. That might have hooked me. You've never thrown a big party for me, and I've been so good all these years. But when this son of yours comes, he doesn't even say this brother of mine. When my brother comes, he doesn't say that. He said this son of yours. He devoured your wealth, and yet you killed the fatted calf and gave him this huge party. So he's really working to put a guilt trip on the dad. Now, if that father had allowed that older son now to manipulate him by playing on his sympathy and making him feel guilty, it would have been the worst thing that he could possibly have done for that older brother. The father would have thought, oh my goodness, that's right. He never has crossed me, not even once. And he would have been falling all over himself to plan a party for him if he had not been hearing God and knowing I can't fall for that manipulation. He would have said, wait till you see the blowout party that I'm going to give you next week. Just wait. Your turn's coming, But he didn't fall for that manipulation. And one of the things we have to realize, when someone is being manipulative, the worst thing we can do is to fall for it and join in it with them. Because that would absolutely then just send them on a road that they don't need to go on. Now, self-pity has a way of sounding very logical, especially to the one now who's in the self-pity. Now, I can feel so justified that it can pull the other person into the guilt if we're not well aware now of what we're doing. But I want you to notice what the father did. He answered the manipulation by telling him the truth in love. And that's how we can overcome manipulation. We have to tell the truth in love. Now, that's what defeats manipulation, speaking the truth and speaking it in love. Okay, verse 31, my child, you have always been with me, and all that's mine is yours. You've always been here. Everything I have belongs to you. Now, the father is representing God here, and he's saying, son, you could have had a party anytime you wanted one, because everything you see around here belongs to you. Now, in a very loving way, what that father was saying, grow up and lay down that selfishness. Lay it down and move on. Now, a little side note here. When we're living an under par life and we're blaming God, the Father is saying to us, everything I have is yours. That's basically what the Father's saying to us. You just haven't taken advantage of what I've made available. And so many times when we're feeling left out, we're feeling down and out, we're not realizing that God has made all of his goodness available to us. Now, if the Father had fallen for that manipulation, it would have pushed that other brother further and further into the selfishness. So many times as a parent, we have to stop and we have to realize it would be really easy to give in to a child when they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and it will push them further into things that are not of God. Now, that father couldn't allow a guilt trip to keep him then from the most important thing that he could do for his son. Now, he knew that he had to pull that older son out of the manipulation. He knew that he had to get him out of the jealousy, get him out of the selfishness. And as parents, that's exactly what we have to learn how to do, because we're going to see our children heading in the wrong direction at times. And sometimes we can feel sorry for them and we can kind of give in to them, and sometimes that's the worst thing we can do. And we have to realize that God will give us a way to show them the love that they need and yet keep them from falling into something that's going to destroy their life. Now, in verse 32, but we had to be merry, he said. We had to rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead, and now he has begun to live. And he was lost, but he's been found. He said, we have to rejoice and be exceedingly glad. In verse 32, the father then was pointing to the older son, and he was pointing out the real issue. He wasn't saying you can't have a party. That's not what he was saying. He was simply pointing out the truth in love. Now, psychologists tell us that introducing guilt now is one of the most common forces used in manipulation. Guilt is the big thing. So when you're thinking about manipulation, you need to write guilt down beside it, because that's what opens the door so many times. Now, that's a self-examination that we need to take ourselves through often. We need to ask ourselves, do I try to make people feel guilty to get what I want? And sometimes we're doing that and we're not even realizing it. But if we'll think about it and ask God, He'll open the door and He'll show us. Sometimes it starts small and we don't even recognize it at first, but it grows. And that's why we have to have our heart open to God. Now, that father represents God, and he neither manipulated to get his younger son home, and he didn't then keep him from leaving home. He didn't keep him from leaving home in the first place. And sometimes we have to let a child realize what they're headed into. Neither did he allow himself to be manipulated, because many times when children are wanting something badly, they have a tendency to manipulate, and we have to watch for that. And God shows us ways to keep that from happening. Now, there's going to be times when you're going to have to be strong enough to look past what's being said to you, even if it sounds logical. What this older brother said sounded very logical, but the father knew that that was not going to be good for him. Now, we're going to have to be willing to look at the truth and be confident enough now not to fall for the intimidation. Now, don't get manipulation now confused with someone coming to you with truth. I'm not wrong to try to change somebody's mind with the truth. When you know the truth, you can change their mind by just talking to them. So many times as a parent, instead of getting angry or giving in to the manipulation, if we start talking, it's amazing. God gives us the ability then to put truth in their hearts and change them and head them in the right direction. Just remember now, the telltale sign of manipulation is a play on the other person's emotions. When they're trying to make a play on maybe using guilt, maybe fear, insecurity, sympathy to get what they're wanting, that's a flashing neon sign that we need to watch for and not fall for it. Now, there's another strange phenomenon about manipulation. If the person succumbs to the pressure that you put on them and they allow you to control them, then they'll begin to lose respect for you. I've seen this happen so many times that someone will try to manipulate another person, and when you fall for it and give in to it, all of a sudden they lose respect for you. That it does the opposite thing. Now, the guy who pressures the girl into giving him sexual privileges will lose respect for the girl. I've seen that happen over and over, even though he's maybe begged her to give in. Now, it's a spiritual principle that comes out of the kingdom of darkness. Now, control and manipulation, it kills respect now on both ends for the other person and for yourself. When you allow yourself to be manipulated or you begin to manipulate, then you'll lose respect for yourself. And so that's another way that God reminds us not to get into that. Now, the number 2 area of manipulation is when someone is made to feel insecure when they're in their rightful place. Now, there are a lot of people who will watch for insecurity in someone else, and they'll begin to create an internal pressure in that person by playing on that insecurity. I've seen this happen so many times. They find a person's insecurity and they use it to bring about the manipulation. For example, on the job site, it's a common ploy now for a manipulator in an attempt to climb up the corporate ladder to watch for weaknesses in other key people in the organization and then very cunningly play on their insecurities to make themselves look good or to look more knowledgeable. Now, I've seen this happen at parties. I'm happy to say that I've never seen it happen at a church party. Never have seen that. But when we were in business, I would go to business parties sometimes, and it was a pretty common practice to see someone attempt now to make somebody feel or appear foolish in order to make themselves look good. That happens a lot in the world. Thank God you're not in a place, you're not doing that, but you'll find that in the world. They'll make another person look bad to make themselves look good. Now, I've watched so many situations where a child would manipulate a parent by playing on the parent's emotions in an attempt to get what they want. Now, that child didn't necessarily know that maybe their parent was insecure, but it's a spiritual force, and that spiritual force working through that child knew what they were doing. Now, if the parent is insecure in his or her role, there are many little manipulative phrases that will do the trick every single time. And you've heard every one of them. All the other kids are getting to go. I'm the only one that's left out. You don't really love me. Or the threat, I don't love you anymore. Single parents especially, they have to be aware of this one. You don't do as much for me. You don't buy me as many clothes as you buy my sister or my brother. What you do for my sister, you leave me out all the time. These are guilt phrases, manipulative phrases that we need to watch for. And you let him get by with murder, and you're always on my back about everything. And if a parent is not really on their toes, sometimes they can take that in and they can start getting into guilt. Or you put too much pressure on me to go to church. I'm going to leave home, if things don't change. And they try to put fear over on the parents. These are things that you will be facing in the very near future in your own home. And you need to be aware of it. You need to recognize that and be prepared. Because to fall for it, you're not only going to bring damage to yourself, but you're going to bring damage to your children. And God shows us ways to stop the manipulation and turn it around and bring good out of it. You'd be surprised how many children even threaten suicide. Well, we've known people in our counseling that would threaten suicide just as a means of manipulation. Parents, if a child demands something by throwing a fit or crying or threatening or pouting, don't ever give in to this. There will never be good fruit that comes out of giving in to manipulation. If you give in even once to a child's manipulation, you're doing that child a grave injustice. And it's not going to be many years until you're going to be facing these things. You're going to have children, and they're lovable and you love them, but we have the responsibility of seeing to it now that they grow up to be the way God wants them to be. And manipulation will never give them the kind of life that you want them to have. Now, I'm going to give you a classic line by a parent who gives in to manipulation. The classic line is, okay, just this once. Because you know not to let them do that, but just this once. How many times have you heard that? Okay, I'll give in just this once. What's really being said, okay, just this once, I'm going to let you manipulate me. It's exactly what it's saying. Now, when we feed manipulation, it's going to grow like an animal. Now, the goal of manipulation is destruction every single time because it comes out of the kingdom of darkness. Okay, now I want to give you this illustration. These parents had this toddler, and he was allowed to sleep with them. And finally, the time came that they decided he needs to be sleeping in his own bed, in his own room. So the first night that they put him in his bed, he didn't like it one little bit. And these were friends of ours. And he cried and he begged, and they put him in that bed anyway, and they told him to stay there. Well, later that evening, he came in, and he was potty trained. But he came in and he announced that he had wet the bed, so he couldn't sleep there. He was going to have to come and sleep with them. Now, that's manipulation at a very, very young age. It just grows and takes on different colors later on. But as young as he was now, he had figured out a way to try to manipulate his parents. And a lot of times what I've seen, parents will say, oh, okay, just this once, and take them into the bed. But to his surprise, they folded a real thick towel, put it back on his bed, and simply told him, no, get in your bed. There are ways you can stop manipulation and save your children. I can't even tell you what you can save your children. And God will give you these answers. He'll tell you how to do this. And it's so easy to fall for the manipulation because you think, oh, just the once. This once, what's it going to hurt? It hurts. One time hurts. We have to come to a place where we say, God, you've put me in a position now to rear my child to be healthy and healed and whole and happy. And I don't want to mess up even one time. Okay, number 3, manipulation is nonverbal means. Now, this is a subtle one. It's subtle, but it's real. And it might be a tone of voice, or maybe it's a facial expression. Have you ever been talking to someone and their tone changed and the look on their face changed? And you turned and you went another direction, not because you really wanted to, but because everything in you swelled up in fear. It brought fear on you. So you turned and you gave in to the manipulation. Now, some people will use pouting, or sometimes they'll use the silent treatment. I had one little boy tell me, my parents haven't spoken to each other in a week. My mama's mad at my dad. And that silent treatment is sometimes a means of manipulation, punishing that other person emotionally. Don't use silent treatments. You're going to grow up and you're going to have a home and a family. God will show you how to handle things face on without having to go the route of manipulation. There's times when you say nothing to prevent an argument. I know that. But that should never, ever last into the night. If you're going to use the silent treatment just to avoid an argument, stop it quickly and don't let it go on into the night, because if you do it once, I promise it'll grow and it'll happen again and again and again. Can't imagine what you open yourself up to. Now, you've heard people say, well, I just have to walk on eggs around that person, or I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to make them angry, so I give in to it. No. Manipulation is offered to everyone, and we can take it, and it grows. It doesn't stay the same. Or we can let God show us ways to very gently and very sweetly stop it at the door. Now, if someone has said that about you, you might be thinking, well, that's their problem. I didn't make them walk on eggs. Well, let me say this, that if people are constantly thinking that they have to walk on eggs to keep from upsetting you, then look at yourself. There is something that's going on inside of you. Or if they're thinking they don't want to rock the boat, they don't want to upset you, or if people are generally feeling like they can't approach you about something, it's easy for us to say, well, that's not my fault. That's their fault. If everybody's saying, or several people are saying that about you, stop and ask God, because there's something that you're doing that's being manipulative, that's causing that kind of reaction from the other people. And it's easy to just say, well, that's their fault and they can get over it. Or you can say, God, I want this out of my life. I want to be pleasing to you. And then more than likely, you need to prayerfully check yourself anytime these things are being said about you, because there's something there. Because that's a pretty good telltale sign that you might be controlling the situation without even realizing it. Now, we need to prayerfully ask God, because if people feel that way around us, sometimes we may be putting out a little manipulative message without even realizing it. And when that be the case, then, if we stop and we say, okay, Lord, there's a possibility that's what I'm doing, God will immediately give us the answer if we ask Him. So many times God's not going to force it on us, but if we ask Him, then I've seen where very gently then the Lord just says, okay, this is what you're doing, and it can change your whole life for the better. One couple I know, they've been married for years and years, and that man is continually walking on eggshells because he's terrified that he's going to cause his wife, as he calls it, to go off her rocker again. I don't know what he means by that, emotionally fall apart or something. So he won't cross her on anything. And I started watching the situation, and I thought, I know why he thinks that. Without her even realizing what she's doing, she's putting out that nonverbal communication that she is emotionally fragile, and that if he doesn't do things her way, she might fall apart. And it's so easy for someone, it doesn't have to be husband and wife, it can be friends doing this, but they can put that message out, and they don't even stop sometimes to even realize they've done it. But if we want to know badly enough, and we just say, okay, Lord, open my eyes and let me see what I'm doing, God will open our, and sometimes it's shocking when He opens our eyes and we think, oh, I can't believe I've been doing that. Now, she was manipulating her husband without even realizing what she was doing. And sometimes husbands can do that too. But all we have to do is just say, God, and you're going to feel it when you're doing something that's not quite right. You can feel it on the inside. And listen to that feeling, and then take it to God. You don't have to run to the maid or to the friend. You can take it to God and say, okay, Lord, am I doing this? And I promise you God will answer you. One young man who graduated from Howard Payne several years ago, he began to date this girl, and she'd been sick practically all of her life. So they started dating. They hadn't been dating very long. We knew him better than we did her. But all of a sudden, her entire attitude was communicating that because of her physical illness, if he left her, she would be physically and emotionally destitute. And I saw her putting this across to him. And I watched that poor boy's dilemma. And he did finally marry her because he felt sorry for her. And he knew he was being manipulated, but he didn't have an answer because he was afraid that it would throw her again into that devastation. I'm going to tell you what, if we use sickness or we use any of these kinds of areas to get something we want, it will end up in tragedy every single time. Maybe you feel good at first of thinking, oh, well, I got my way, I got what I needed. But it'll end up in tragedy every single time. It's worth whatever it takes for us to go before God and say, God, anything that's in me that is being manipulative to get something I think I want or I think I need, then we need to lay on our face before God and let Him show us, and we need to be willing to hear to get it out of us. Now, it was almost as though since he didn't have any answers, for her well-being, that he just kind of accepted the situation as his responsibility. And what I thought was interesting is that later the mother came to Brownwood and I met with her, and she picked up on the manipulation, and he asked me about it, She didn't have any answers for the girl either, and she fell right into the trap with her son. I didn't point out the girl and say, okay, she's doing this and she's doing that. That wasn't my business. But I just said, pray about it. You need to pray because this is something that could be harmful for the marriage. But they just couldn't face it, and so they just sort of took the girl on as their responsibility. And I thought, what kind of marriage is this going to be? And sure enough, it turned out to be a very sad marriage. But y'all, we can stop these things at the door. God will give us answers. He'll tell us what to do. When you see these kinds of things, especially if you see something in your own life and you think, well, this just kind of makes life a little bit easier. If you see these things in your own life, stop it. Stop it at that moment. I don't think the girl was that sick, but it was just a subtle tool that she had learned to use to get what she wanted. It was just sad. It was sad. It hurt me for a long time. Now, so many people are totally unaware that they're using these nonverbal types of manipulation to get what they want. And the nonverbal ones are the easiest to fall for. When it's something that's being spoken, manipulation being spoken, it's easy to see it and take a step back. But the nonverbal, it's very easy to pass over it, and the enemy sees to it that we don't even notice it many times. But God will show us if we want to know badly enough. And then sometimes it takes some strength to stop it, but it's worth it. God has ways to have us have such good lives. He has ways to make our existence so happy and so right. But we have to be listening, because sometimes it's such a tiny little thing at first that we hardly even notice it. But I promise that if you'll pay attention, God will start pointing it out. And because He wants our lives to be wonderful. He wants them to be happy. It's just a matter of saying, God, you're impressing me with something. I want to listen, and I want you to help me take care of it. So we have to be very careful that we never follow anger, or we never follow a mood change or frustration or irritation or whatever to become so that it becomes so prevalent that it puts people in fear of approaching us. If people are afraid to approach you about something, to tell you something, stop right then and realize there's a manipulative little ploy that's there that we need to watch for. Even if we're not doing it on purpose, sometimes we can be operating in manipulation without even realizing we're not doing it on purpose. But if it's happening on a fairly regular basis, something is happening in the spiritual realm, and it's not God, and God is trying to get our attention. Now, many men manipulate a situation with hot tempers. I've seen that so many times. And women can do it too, but mostly I see men falling in this one. Because people finally come to the point that they don't want to contend with anger. They just think, oh, it's just not worth it. Let me tell you something. If it's bothering you, stop and get it taken care of, because those kinds of things, they don't stay the same, they grow. So to give in to it now, when the tempers begin to flare, then don't just say, okay, I want to avoid the confrontation. Stop and say, no, God was going to give me the strength. We can talk this out. Now, a lot of women tend toward moodiness, and the ones around her then, they give in a lot of times because you don't like to be around somebody that's just moody, so you just sometimes give in to it. But I'm telling you, it's not worth it. When you see these things in yourself, when you see them in somebody else, stop. Sometimes it can be taken care of so easily. But if we leave it alone and let it go because we just don't want to have to face it, it never turns out good. Sometimes husbands and wives will hold back physical love, or they'll hold back sexual privileges just in an attempt to get their way. There's ways you can stop and say, we have to talk this out. We can't let this stand. There's so much game playing in marriages today, and most of you are at the point where it won't be many years until you'll be in a marriage situation. And if you know to watch for these things ahead of time, it's amazing how much better your marriage can be. And like I say, there's so much game playing in marriages, and every bit of it, all that game playing, it all spells manipulation. Anytime there's game playing, that's not God. Now, Jack and I had been married probably less than a month when we had an argument. And one night, and we both grabbed our pillows like we were going to go sleep someplace else, And all of a sudden, we both stopped, and at the same time, we both said no. I remember, when we did that, we laughed. We said, we're not going to start our marriage off like this with this kind of manipulative game playing. And grabbing your pillow and saying, okay, I'm going to go sleep someplace else. No. Stop right then and talk it out, because God will help you stop something right then that you do not want to get started. Now, game playing is one of the most deadly forms of manipulation that you can do in any relationship, and especially in marriage. Now, I put game playing at the top of the list of this nonverbal manipulation. Although game playing can get over into areas where it's not so nonverbal. Sometimes it'll start out nonverbal and it moves. But just a notation here, the people who are convinced that manipulation is not their area of weakness, and they're quick to dismiss the whole subject, they need to look then at it more closely, because if you're saying, no, I don't do that, that's not anything I do, stop, make yourself look at it, because something's being hidden from you, something the enemy's trying to slip past you. And so we need to look at this third area of controlling with nonverbal manipulation, because this is really subtle. This is a subtle form of manipulation, and I've lived a long time. So I've seen a lot of these kinds of things that start out so small, and it wouldn't take much to get it back in order. But we think, oh, what's the big deal? And so we let it go, and it grows. It always grows. So I'm telling you from observation, I'm telling you from the 30 years of being, pastoring a church, we've seen a lot. And I've often thought, this and this and this one that I see over here, they could have been stopped so quickly. Don't put up with these kinds of things. Certainly don't put up with it in yourself. And talking it out, it can sometimes be taken care of in 5 minutes. Okay, we're going to take up here next week, and we're going to look at the other 5 areas of manipulation. And when we finish this 2-part series on manipulation, I think you're going to find that it can really bring about a purification in your spiritual walk and a happiness that you can't even imagine the difference it can make. And so I want you to just think of some of these things, maybe little things that you're doing and it's not quite right, but it's not that big a deal. It is that it will become that big a deal. So it's worth whatever it takes to stop and say, Lord, I don't want even the teeniest little bit of this in my life. I want to pray, I want to give it to you, and as we do, it's amazing how God can take care of things so quickly. And so, Father, you are such a good God. You are so good. And Father, I've seen through the years things that could have been stopped and changed and made right so quickly. But Father, so many times we just think, it's no big deal. Lord, I pray that each one of us will say, if it's not right, it is a big deal. If it's not right, it can be fixed so easily if we turn it over to you, Lord. And Father, I'm asking in Jesus' name that we will submit ourselves to you, and we'll be willing to hear anything you have to say to us. And we'll be willing to change it and allow you to put us on the right path. God, you're so good. You want us to have good lives. And sometimes it's such a tiny little thing that if it's changed early on, it can change our life for good more than we could ever have dreamed possible. Father, I pray for every single person in this room. Father, so many of them are getting close to the marrying age. And Father, I thank you that each one of them are going to be willing to get before you and say, Lord, I do not want manipulation in my life. Manipulation is such a tool of the enemy. I don't want it. So, Father, I submit myself to you. I submit my decisions to you. And I do not want manipulation. And I want you to just, each time that it even presents itself, Father, I'm asking that you will just stop and say, wait, take a look, stop, listen. Because, Father, you want to help us more than we want to be helped. And you're so good, Lord. We love you and we praise you. In Jesus' name.